right, so in order to set up post-processing in your scene, you need something called a post-process volume, which I've already got in this environment, as you can see here. And it's enabling things like lens flares and screen dirt and bloom and things like that. So in order to get a post-process volume inside your environment, you just go over to your Place tab and you type in Process, and then you can just drag it in. Now, as you can see, it's a cube. It's about the same size as a a light mass importance volume. You can go in and scale it, obviously, by adding in values here, or you can scale it using the gizmo. Now, by default, only views inside of the post-process volume are going to be affected by the post-processing effects. But if you want to change that, you can go into your post-process volume settings with it selected and check this box that says infinite extent, which makes it unbound. It's basically going to affect your entire environment, or affect your entire environment. So what that means is you can have one overall post-process volume for your environment, and then you can have multiple post-process volumes that only affect views inside of them for different things like a pool of water, or maybe a hot area of your environment, and all that can have different depth of field, different tints to your scene, and things like that as you pass through them. So I'm going to delete this one and go back into the one that I already have set up in my scene. And then I'm going to go through all of the features of the post-process volume that I'm using for this scene. The first thing that I want to do is show you the difference in the screen space reflection settings. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to disable the planar and box reflection capture actors just to make it a little bit more apparent what's going on. So as you see under the post-processing volume, I have a bunch of different features. I have color grading, I have film, I have lens, rendering features, post-processing settings, etc. Right? So I want to go under rendering features. I'm going to go under screen space reflections. And then under screen space reflections, you can see I have an overall intensity slider. If I set it to 0, they're basically disabled, and go all the way up to 100, and they're fully enabled. Quality, I have a slider that can go all the way down to 0, all the way up to 100. This basically controls the transition between roughness values and whether or not those get reflections. If you pay attention to it, you can kind of see there's a more harsh cutoff. Now, you can actually scrub it all the way up to 100, but it's actually capped at 70 by default. Even if it shows 100 here, you're not getting the full quality of the reflections. So in order to fix that, if you go into Window, Developer Tools, and Output Log, this is your console in Unreal Engine 4. If you type in r.ssr and then quality, r.ssr.quality, and you'll see by default this is actually set to 3. I need to bump this up to 4 to get the full 100% quality out of my screen space reflections. So if you pay attention, I have my quality set to 100. And if you look at this area here, you'll be able to see the difference when I change this to 3. So this is at 3. This is at 4. So you can see how it smooths out the transitions between the screen space reflections. I'm not exactly sure why Epic set the maximum value to 3, but I'm sure it has to do with performance versus quality. So I'm going to set it back to that default value. But just keep that in mind that if you ever, once I set it to 70, you'll see that there's no difference in quality here. If I drop down to 50, you'll see it degrade a little bit. If I bump up to 100, and then back to 70, there's no difference. So I set it back to 100, and then I set my screen space quality back to 4, and then I drop it down to 70. You'll see that it looks like it did at 100 before I set this to 4. So just keep that in mind when you're setting up your environment. If you want the maximum quality, then it's a good thing to go in and set this to a value of 4. So once again, it's r.ssr.quality, and then whatever value you want it to be, 4 being the highest. So the next thing that I want to go over with the post-processing volume is I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what all of these things do. I might not be using all of them in this environment, but I'll give you a quick overview of what they all do. So under color grading, these are pretty straightforward if you do any kind of video editing. You've got your temperature, your tint, saturation, contrast, gamma, gain, and offset for global. And then you have those same settings for your shadows, for your midtones, your highlights. And then under miscellaneous, you have your blue correction, whether or not you can expand your gamut, scene color tint, color grading LUT, which stands for lookup table, the intensity for that, and then your color grading LUT itself, which you can bring in here. If you go under film, you have settings for your slope, toe, shoulder, black clip, and white clip. These are all going to control the look of your scene. Mobile tone mapper, these are specific for mobile. So you have your tint, saturation, contrast, your tint for shadow, your tint shadow blend, your tint shadow amount, your channel mixer for RGB, your crush shadows, highlights, and your dynamic range. Now under lens is where you have a lot of effects that you might use pretty often. So you have chromatic aberration. So chromatic aberration is basically separating your RGB channels. It almost gives you an effect of watching a 3D video without 3D glasses. And if you use it very subtly, like very low values, you can actually create a more organic feeling environment. Or you can use it for effects like if you want a player to be drunk or have blurred vision or something like that, you can use it for that. And you also have an offset for your chromatic aberration. You've also got your bloom settings. So under bloom, you have different methods of bloom, right? So you have your standard, and then you have convolution. So convolution of bloom is actually the highest quality, and it's usually too expensive for games, as you can see here. When you do the rollover, it's usually designated for cinematics, but it's going to give you the highest quality of bloom, and it's going to be all just based on emissive values and things that you input here. And then for standard, you have your overall intensity, which you can adjust. This is obviously also going to be amplified by the emissive values of your materials and things like that. You have a threshold as well, basically going to be a modifier of your intensity. You have a convolution kernel, which you can throw in here. You can use any kind of like a bokeh shape or something like that if you want to. Then under advanced, you have different things you can go in and modify because your bloom can be based on the elements of your lens, so you can have multiple sizes for each element. You can have a tint for each of those elements, your convolution scale, which is only enabled when you're using convolution. Right? If I set it to standard, you'll see that that option does not become available anymore. So anything that has convolution before it is just going to be available if you have convolution as your method selected. The next one going down under lens effects would be your dirt mask. So as you can see, I'm already using a dirt mask in my scene. So if I look up towards this brighter light, you can see these little particles on my screen. That's a dirt mask. And if I go in and bump up the intensity, you can see what it looks like even more. So it stays stationary on your camera, and it only shows up when light passes through it. So it's mimicking dirt on a lens. And then the texture that you use for that can be anything you want. I'm just using the specific texture that I created for it. And you can obviously go in and tint your dirt mask as well with this value here. Now moving on, if you go under camera, you have shutter speed, you have your ISO, you have your aperture, you have your maximum aperture, which is your minimum f-stop, and you have your number of diaphragm blades you can put in here, and you have your exposure compensation. Now, all of these relate to depth of field, but only using specific depth of field methods. So we'll get to depth of field in a moment, but you'll see if I enable circle depth of field, for example, and I go in and start checking these. And as I change the depth of field type, it's going to enable or disable these here. So moving down, we're going to go into exposure. So exposure controls your eye adaptation, right? So if I look into a darker area of the scene, it's going to get a little bit, the screen's going to brighten up. And if I look into a brighter part of the scene, it's going to get darker. So if I look back really quick, you'll see that it's adjusting. So this is basically HDR, or eye adaptation. So you can control the metering mode here. So it can be based on an exposure histogram, an exposure basic, or you can do a manual adjustment. And then you also have your minimum and maximum brightness value. So as you scrub these, the minimum and maximum values that they'll go to will be adjusted. And this is all going to depend on what look you're going for your scene and all that. And then you have a speed up and speed down. So speed up basically controls how long it takes for it to go from dark to light, and speed down does the opposite, from light to dark. And you also have all these advanced settings down here. You have a low and high percentage, a histogram, log, minimum, maximum, and a calibration constant. And those all just modify how your exposure works. And then moving down, you have lens flares. So you can control the overall intensity of your lens flare. So if I look up here, you can see I have lens flares. They're pretty subtle in this environment, but I can go in and bump them up if I want to. I can modify the bokeh size. It's basically controlling the scale and feathering of it. And then I can also do a threshold, which is going to obviously just modify the overall intensity. So I'm going to drop it down back to where it was. And then you have a bokeh shape. So I can use a bokeh shape for my lens flares, or if I don't want to, it's just going to be a round lens flare based on the shape of the object casting the lens flare, which in this case is this square port in the hatch. You can also tint your lens flares if you like. And you can also tint for all of these elements here. Now going into imaging effects or image effects, you have a vignette intensity, so you can actually add a vignette into your scene. You have grain intensity and then grain jitter, so you can have like a film grain effect over your scene. Moving down, we have depth of field, which I already mentioned a little bit earlier. So depth of field, you have multiple methods for depth of field. Bokeh is going to be the least expensive. Actually, sorry, Gaussian is going to be least expensive. Bokeh is in the middle, and then circle is going to be the highest. So if I leave it to bokeh, and then the reason I'm not seeing any depth of field is because my scale is set to 0, right? So as I bump up the scale, you can see that the blur is starting to take effect. And this is going to be based on my focal distance, obviously. And then my focal region. And then my focal transition region. And then my far transition region. So all those things are going to affect how my blur looks for my depth of field. And then if I go into Gaussian depth of field, you can see that it's affected a little bit differently by those same settings. Now, circle depth of field is going to be the highest quality depth of field, and this is usually reserved for cinematics. So basically how circle depth of field works is more based on the camera setup itself. So as I mentioned before, you have your shutter speed, your ISO, your aperture, your f-stop, all of that good stuff. So your f-stop and your minimum f-stop, or your aperture and your maximum aperture, are going to kind of control overall what your circle depth of field is, and then you can set your minimum maximum distance as well. So if I set this to like 20 or 10 or 5, you can see that it's a lot more realistic of a depth of field, especially if I get closer to these objects here. But it's also a lot more expensive to render than the other depth of field methods. So I'm going to set it back to where it was. And then down here you have some more advanced features for this, so you can control the shape of your depth of field, the occlusion, color threshold, size threshold, sky distance, and vignette size. So if your sky, you don't want your sky to blur, but you want everything else to, then you can tell it how far away the sky is. All right, so moving down, going into rendering features. So under rendering features, you have post-process materials. I'm not going to get too in-depth into this, but you can basically create a material that you can apply to your screen for things like rain dripping down your lens, or a character being drunk or something like that. And this can actually be applied directly to your camera. And then you just apply those as an array here. Moving down, you have an ambient cube map. So you can actually use a cube map for your diffuse and specular shading, and then it blends additively. So it's different from, it's a little bit different from your standard cube map. And you just have this set up in your post-processing volume. And then going into ambient occlusion. So ambient occlusion is basically the area where objects intersect, and there's going to be a little bit of darkening where those objects intersect. It's basically diffusing the light a little bit. So you can control that, those values here. You have your radius, and then you have your intensity. And you have some advanced settings for it as well, and all these are pretty self-explanatory. And then you have your global illumination. So when you use indirect lighting, as I showed you before, it has its own bounce value. It automatically, bounce light around and illuminate areas that aren't directly illuminated and things like that. You can actually control via post-process effect the overall intensity of that. So even after you've built your lighting, you can go in and modify your indirect lighting intensity using post-processing. And you can even go in and tint the color of it, right? And then down here you have motion blur. So by default, motion blur is enabled. So sometimes you'll notice when you're, checking out your reflections or something like that, and you have things moving through it, it looks kind of blurry. That's usually because motion blur is already enabled by default. I usually like to disable it when I'm working, and then I go and enable it when I'm actually getting ready to do a build or something like that. So you can control your amount of motion blur, the maximum distortion caused by the motion blur, and then the per object size. These settings control everything for the light propagation volume, which I showed you a little bit earlier, which is the real-time global illumination that only works on directional lights. So you can control the overall intensity, the size of the voxelized grid, and things like that. They're all pretty self-explanatory. And you just use these when you have that enabled, and you can control the overall look of it. Screen space reflections I already touched on. Just remember that console variable that I showed you to make the quality actually utilize 100. And then if you go into miscellaneous, you can set your actual screen's percentage for your view. And then back into post-process volume settings. So you can enable or disable your post-process volume. You can set it to whether or not it's an infinite extent, which means it's affecting your entire environment. You can modify the blend weight. So basically, if you have two overlapping post-processing volumes, you can choose whether or not one actually blends at its full weight. Or if you want it to be an overall setting, you can control how much of an effect it has. So if I set this one to 0, it's actually not doing anything in my scene. If I set it to 0.5, it's only half of its intensity. And if I set it to 1, it's its full intensity. Blend radius, if you have infinite extent unchecked, this is basically if you have... once again, this is how many units from the edge of the volume it actually starts blending into the surface, to the actual post-processing volume. And then priority, if you have multiple post-process volumes overlapping, then you can modify which one takes priority over the other.